Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Russell Matthews here, and at this point most people would agree that the CRB, the CERB before it, the CRSB and the CRCB have been necessary supports for people throughout this pandemic. And while these programs definitely aren't perfect, when compared to other countries it definitely seems pretty generous. But the number one complaint about these programs is just how much it's costed the government to implement. And it has a lot of people concerned that it could be you who pays for it. Whenever the government has had to spend vast amounts of money in the past, we see one of two things. They either increase tax rates for Canadians all across the country, or they'll end up cutting programs to try to save a little bit of money. But it seems there could be another way. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are bringing to the table an idea that would tax the wealthiest Canadians in the country, and it would also tax businesses who have profited from the pandemic. And there are a lot of pros to this idea, but there are also a lot of cons. So today we're going to take a look at exactly what they're saying, how it could affect you, and whether or not it would actually work. But before we do, if you're new to the channel, hey, how's it going? It's nice to meet you. My name's Russell, and on this channel I post videos about Canadians and their money, with the overall goal of bringing information as quickly as possible to Canadians so that they can set themselves up to live a more financially stable future. If that sounds good to you, and let's face it, who doesn't want a little bit more stability in their financial lives, then you're going to want to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. And hey, while you're down there, hit that like button and turn it blue, because when you do, it shows the video to hundreds more people who could be looking for exactly this information. Thanks so much for doing that. Now let's take a closer look at this new proposal. Here's the longer press conference that was about a half hour, but we're only going to look at the parts that are most impactful for you.
That in difficult times, which we know we're in right now, what do you do? What choice do you make? We know that families are struggling. They're having a hard time with a lot of things, finding childcare, paying the bills. People have lost jobs. Small businesses are worried about shutting down forever. So there's people that have gone through really difficult times, have made some big sacrifices. But at the same time, we know there's some groups of Canadians that have done really well. The richest Canadians, the billionaires, have increased their wealth by $37 billion since March. We know there's been massive profits, not just normal profits, but record profits for some companies. And we know that the wealthiest Canadians, the top billionaires in Canada, have seen none of their wealth decrease during this pandemic. So while everyday folks have been struggling, those at the very top have actually been doing really well. And if we have to make a choice about who pays, who contributes more, who helps with the cost of this pandemic, and who helps us get through this difficult time, well, everyday people have already made the sacrifice. And what we're saying is that the people at the very top should pay their fair share. And the way we do that, we'll propose two things in our motion today.
Okay, so let's pause it there for a second. The main point of what he just said was that in his eyes, the working class, everyday Canadian has already paid the price for COVID. People have lost jobs or on the other hand needed to work in a stressful and new work environment due to the pandemic. So what he and the NDP are saying is that the wealthiest people should be the ones on the hook to sort of match that amount of sacrifice, because he's saying that they haven't paid their fair share. While working Canadians have already lost their jobs and been put into tough situations, though the wealthiest really haven't seen that, or at least that's what he's claiming.
One is a wealth tax, which we talked about before. It's a 1% on fortunes of over 20 million. And a tax on excess profit, inspired by what we did in the past during the world wars, that companies that have made record profits, that their excess profit above and beyond normal, what they've made off the pandemic, that should be taxed at a much higher rate so they can contribute to the cost of this recovery. Those who've actually profited and done really well should be the ones that actually have to pay the price, and not the people that have struggled and have been hurt and that are worried. They should not be the ones. And we should use that revenue to pay for the recovery, but to pay for the programs we need. So to bring in...
Okay, so that's the bulk of what Jagmeet says here. They go on to go to talk to another expert, but they just kind of reiterate what he's been saying. So he's proposing a wealth tax, and this is actually something that was part of his platform, I believe, from when he was running to be the prime minister back in the most recent election. And that tax would be a 1% tax on the overall wealth of people who have over $20 million. He then goes on to say that the businesses that have profited from the pandemic, he later says through no fault of their own, should be the ones that are having to pay more. So like an increased corporate tax rate for those who have profited above average. And those are the two main ideas of his proposal on how we can pay for the deficit that we're spending ourselves into right now with the pandemic. Now, right off the bat, this is going to sound quite good to a lot of Canadians. I mean, it sounds good that the people who have more than enough to live their lives should be able to help to subsidize the people who don't make as much money. Just from my own personal experience, I've found this to be the opinion of most people who are sort of in that millennial millennial or slightly younger than millennial age category. And it reminds me of some financial advice that I got a while back, and I like to say it to a lot of people. And it sounds overly simplistic, but it really helps you conceptualize how to balance these finances, both in your own personal life and how the government might be conceptualizing this as well. And it goes like this. In order to improve your personal financial position, there are two levers that you can pull on that do different things. The first lever is how much money you make, and the second lever is how much money you spend. And these are two levers that you more or less have an ability to control in your life. And by looking at where those levers are for any given person, you can get a good idea of how financially healthy they are. For example, if you have somebody who has a low income but spends a ton, you're going to have a pretty good idea that they're in a poor financial position. Another option is you have a low income but you don't spend a lot. You should be okay. And of course, the flip side of it is if you have a high income, but then you spend a lot, then that's also not the best in terms of setting yourself up for a positive financial future. But the best position you can be is having a high income and not spending a lot. If you can strive to have the levers in these positions for as much of your life as possible, you're going to be able to retire earlier, do more things that you want to do in your life because you're going to have that financial freedom. And now when we apply that to this situation with the government, they have those exact same levers, how much money they make through taxes and other collections, and how much money they spend through the programs that they put into place. What Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are saying is that most other parties will focus on bringing this spending lever down as low as they possibly can by cutting programs. He's suggesting that if you keep this lever right here in the middle with some moderate spending, and you look for ways to increase the income or money that you can make, then that could sort of balance itself out. And the way that he's suggesting that we raise this income lever is by taxing the wealthy. The idea is that this 1% tax plus an additional business tax on business who have, in his words, participated in pandemic profiteering, they should have to pay a little bit more money to balance that out. And while finding a way to increase the government's income in order to pay off all this debt without increasing the tax rates for the average Canadian seems like a good idea, people have been pointing out some flaws in this idea. First off, with the tax on businesses who have made money during this pandemic, it sounds like it's a pretty subjective idea, and it would be difficult to prove without any doubt that it was the pandemic that allowed for this increase in profits. Of course, there will be some businesses that without a doubt you'll be able to see the correlation in their earnings versus the date of when COVID started, but I'm sure there are companies that are closer to that sort of middle line where it would be pretty difficult to actually prove that they profited from COVID. Later on in the press conference, a reporter actually asked Jagmeet about this, like how are we going to determine what excess profit is? And here's his response.
Do you have any specifics on how you define this?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And it's very important because it is something that's fluid. And so what we're proposing is there's many ways to do it. What we could do is we could look at what is a normal trend for this company over the past number of years. Even if there's an increased trend, they're increasing their profits by a certain margin every year. Looking at what that trend is and where they should be and comparing it where they are. We know that there's been in excess of what normally a company earns in this time period. There's companies that have made massive profits. So anything that's outside of what they would normally make or is on a trend of what a company would normally make should be then considered excess. We could also look at percentages in terms of what percentage would be within the normal course and what percentage is above and beyond that, and that could be attributed to COVID-19. So there's ways for us to set that. Is it, a certain figure over and above what the normal profit would be? We can also make sure that it's clear that it's not about small businesses that have done well in this time. We made the motion very clear about big corporations, large corporations. So we've got definitions around what a small business is already in our Canada tax code. So we can look at what large corporations have made massive profits in this time, and it's very obvious which companies have done really well. So we could look at a number of ways to do it. Our point is we have to do the work. Instead of putting the burden on people, we should ask those who've done really well in this time to pay their fair share. That's our assertion, and we're very open to finding the best way to do that.
Okay, so there's a pretty good answer. I mean, he says we're very open to finding the best way to do that. That kind of sounds like there's not a 100% solid plan and they're just kind of putting this idea out there. But hopefully behind the curtains, the NDP has some ideas on how they would actually implement this if they were ever given the opportunity to. And of course, there's the age-old argument that when you increase corporate taxes, you decrease the amount of jobs available to Canadians because of businesses who are not wanting to do business in Canada because of these less favorable tax rules. Now, the second way they want to increase this government income is by taxing the overall wealth of the richest Canadians over $20 million in net worth. And they're proposing a 1% tax on this. So that's every single year. So if you had a $20 million net worth, that would be $200,000 a year that you would have to pay into this tax at 1%. And of course, that would scale up. If you have somebody who has $200 million, then that would be $2 million that they'd be paying. Now, I'm curious about how they would actually do this and whether or not it would actually be effective. Generally, the people who are the wealthiest in Canada also have the best knowledge of our tax code and their options on ways to make their businesses and make their lives as tax efficient as possible. Now, I'm not an accountant, but I can imagine that there are ways to hold your wealth in an area that doesn't actually show up as underneath your name, like some sort of family trust, or hold inside of your corporation instead of in your actual name, so that you could potentially avoid a tax like this. So I wonder how effective it would actually be if people were trying to avoid it, like most wealthy people do, try to avoid paying as much taxes and be as efficient as possible. It's definitely something that's interesting to think about. And just like the old argument for the businesses, I wonder if this might drive some of the wealthiest Canadians out of the country. If you had a $200 million net worth, would you be willing to pay $2 million every single year as a Canada tax to live in the country? I don't know. But regardless of whether or not it would actually work in implementation, there is one other problem that I see here, and that's the amount we would actually be collecting based on the wealth of Canadians that are in the country right now. A little while back, the NDP asked the PBO, or the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to take a look at this idea for the wealth tax and see how much we'd actually be able to collect based on what Canadians live in the country and what their wealth is. And on July 8th of this year, they actually came back with these stats, and it might surprise you. If you've never heard of the PBO, or the Parliamentary Budget Officer, this is an office or a group of people that don't adhere to either political party, and it's their pure job to do some financial analysis, and they're only beholden to Parliament. So in Parliament, they can ask the PBO to go do some analysis and do some study so that they can have a better idea of what laws to put into place. And this is the actual report that they filed when the NDP asked them to take a look at this wealth tax. And I was a little bit underwhelmed at the results of it, right? We have this $20 million cap. This is all the information we've talked about. But when we scroll down here to see the actual results, we're saying that the total net revenue of this measure would be $5.6 billion in 2020-2021. And while $5.6 billion does seem like a lot of money when you hear that out of context, it's actually a small amount of money when it comes to the overall spending that we've done so far because of the pandemic. This is the Canadian government's website that covers all of the stats just for CERB. We're not even talking about CRB yet. This is just the numbers for that first benefit, the emergency response benefit that started back in March. Right here, you'll see that there were 8.9 million unique applicants for this benefit, and they processed 27 million applications, but what they spent was $81.64 billion. So when we actually look at it, just for CERB, this wealth tax would only pay for about 7% of the entirety of the CERB spending. Now remember, that's just for the wealth tax, and it's not talking about these increased business taxes that they're proposing, but still, that's a pretty underwhelming number for something that's being touted as the solution to our problems. And while this tax and these plans might be good in the long term, the idea that they're a one-stop shop for solving all of our COVID-related budget problems is a little bit far-fetched. In any typical situation, a tax like this could go further to expanding some of Canada's important programs. But right now, in a time unlike any other, it seems like a tax like this and the revenue it would bring in would just be a drop in the bucket of the overall spending that we've done during the pandemic, and it wouldn't really solve the problem in its entirety. But for this topic specifically, I'm really curious on what you have to say about it. I'm personally undecided on whether or not it would be a good idea or a bad idea, and I like to stay as unbiased as possible and bring the information from both sides to you here so you can make up your own mind. Do you think this sort of wealth tax is something that would be good for the long run of Canada, or do you think that it would be awful, it would ruin the economy, it would cut jobs, all of these ideas? Let me know down in the comments what you think. And while you're down there, make sure to hit that like button. I would really appreciate your help in growing this channel, and I'm sure the people who get this information spread to them because of that click would appreciate it as well. And of course, if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. I'm constantly bringing updates that could help you and your Canadian family out. But with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope that this has opened your eyes to this idea and the pros and cons of it, and I'll see you next time.